external affairs. But when the war in Iran-Iraq started, since 1976, 78, in China, the regime deeply had changed. From the Maoist era, China was living the period of Deng Xiaoping, who introduced a very deep transformation in the issues and in the targets of this country. The most important factor that the communist elite under Deng Xiaoping and also the following ones up to the actual one and perhaps the next ones is the economic growth of this country. The social and commercial development under the management and the direction of the Communist Party, the so-called socialism with Chinese characteristics. So that's why when the war started, China changed deeply its commitment to Iran and Iraq. China saw these countries such as new markets to expand its business, its traffic. Some interpretations during the 80s tried to present Genghis China during the Iran-Iraq war, such as a policy, a strategic line that tried to take the place of the Soviet Union in the Middle East, because the Soviet Union was less powerful during this period in the Middle East area. But after a while, we discovered that it was a very sophisticated and very diplomatic version of the truth. The truth is that China saw Iran and Iraq such as countries to tie to itself to develop its business. In which kind of business could it be? The sale of weapons. I told you about the Soviet Union because Soviet Union was the principal weapon sellers in the Middle East area, especially for Iran and for Iraq. But China became so powerful in this region to overcome this kind of situation, also because, as I told you before, the Soviet power in the Middle East up to the end of the 80s was slightly weakening itself. The very curious way for the Chinese Communist Party to develop this business is the typical way of the Chinese Communist elite. When the conflict started, China was in very good relations with Iran and Iraq, both countries. Did not, as I heard yesterday, try to present any resolution to the Council of the United Nations to solve the conflict. Not directly, and never it did it until the almost end of the war, until 1987. In this indirect way, China started to look for the way to sell weapons, and did it, but never directly. China used intermediate countries, Jordan, North Korea, and Syria. And in this way, had the opportunity to sell weapons to both these countries. So it's very important to underline how this war tested China's definitions in this area, in the Middle East, giving a preference to the economic targets than on the diplomatic ones. China was not interested in the peace of the countries. China understands that she could really take a very great advantage from the war, and as I told you, it was because of the selling of the weapons. The strategic view that the war, the Iran-Iraq war, gave to China was very particular, because the war presented the Chinese Communist Party a dilemma. Both the nations, Iran and Iraq, were considered friends of China. That's why, officially, all the Communist Party elites, such as Cao Xiang, Prime Minister, and the Deputy Prime Minister, and other important personalities of the Communist Party, declared that the conflict would be resolved peacefully through negotiations, and that the situation would not deteriorate. But in fact, China feeded both the countries to keep on with the war, selling weapons. The production of these weapons and weapons parts made in China was an easy alternative also for both Iran and Iraq. For they were clients of the Soviet Union in this specific part of the market. China concerned with general economic growth, and it was, and is still today, the most important targets of the Chinese Communist Party. There are some academics also that consider that the Iran-Iraq war and the sale of weapons was also represented also a very important interest for the People's Liberation Army, because it gave to the army of China the chance to show how Chinese weapons were efficient and presented a very good degree of usage. We can also say that China conducted approximately 3.9 billion dinars with agreements with Iran, and 5.52 billion with Iraq. So it's a very great amount of money. In a comparison between the two countries, China became Iran's dominant supplier of weapons than to Iraq. In sum, we can say that Chinese foreign policy during the Iran-Iraq war yielded many benefits for China. First, the Chinese earned billions in hard currency through arms deals that were used to fuel continued economic growth. Second, its military support for both regimes, even if China was playing both ends against the middle, fostered with both governments A third reason could be that war offered an opportunity to test, as I told you, Chinese military technology. And fourth, the war went a long way toward augmenting China's prestige and relevance in the Middle Eastern region. I have still 2 minutes?
No, you have about 8 minutes.
Okay, and these are going to be very hot minutes because the Iran-Iraq war was also considered in a very certain and particular way for the view of, as I told you before, the People's Liberation Army strategy. It was considered the war of the cities, a war that was condemned in a very pessimistic view because of attacks during cities. The use of missiles has been very impressive to the PLA strategy, and it is considered the first war outside Asia that China validated as an example of a war, of asymmetric war, to insert in the military text for the army. It is considered a very important example, much more important than, for instance, the 1995-96 exercises in the Taiwan Straits that had a very big influence on these debates. So, what can we say? More generally, the 1980-88 war was a formative juncture for determining in the future China's Middle East foreign policy. The PCR economic target gave to China the chance to starting bilateral relationships in this area of the world, which is the Middle East, and starting the Chinese Communist Party struggle to make a crystallization of China's true interests, which are economic ones. This is my conclusion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so now we move on to Bogdan Zhivkovic's presentation. Bogdan is a researcher in the Institute for Persian Studies in Belgrade, and he will talk about Yugoslavia, the non-aligned countries, and the Iran-Iraq war.
Thank you. So first of all, as all of us before, I would like to thank everybody here, Professor Mazzari, Antonella, Rosario, for the warm hospitality we truly encountered. And it's not a phrase, and I really hope that I will have a chance to have an opportunity in Belgrade to match your hospitality. So regarding my presentation, its generic title can appear as incoherent, but I assure you that these three terms are very, very well connected between them, and that they were intertwined during the 80s. The bonds between the non-aligned movement and the war itself appear obvious, because it was a brutal conflict of hitherto unseen dimensions of two member states. And on the other hand, the Yugoslav position towards the war, which will be the primary focus of my presentation, cannot be described without considering Belgrade's policies towards the non-aligned movement and the history of the movement itself in the 1980s. So, in order to give an analysis of the Yugoslav position on the war, I would like to firstly make two separate introductions. One would be a brief description of the history of the non-aligned movement in the 80s, and the other one would be a brief description of the general topics and problems of the Yugoslav foreign policy in the 80s. So regarding the non-aligned movement in the 80s, the 1970s, the decade before that, was in fact the pinnacle of the movement. It was a time when its conferences became regular. It was a time when the group movement grew in number, but it also grew in impact. And using the United Nations as its main vehicle of its agency, it managed to impose the views of non-aligned countries on international relations. However, in the 80s, it was demonstrated that this growth of the non-aligned movement was dependent on the detente, and with the deterioration of the relations between the two superpowers and the blocs, the movement entered into a crisis. And there are several reasons why the 80s can be described as the time of crisis of non-alignment. One of them could be the fact that the movement was focused on economic issues and on the global North-South dialogue, but the United States managed to, through bilateral economic relations with member states, hinder this unified approach of the bloc and divide it on these issues. On the other hand, there is also the question of division of wealth within the movement. So, for instance, the OPEC countries were much richer, so the movement in its entirety couldn't have a unified policy, because some countries were richer and therefore had different approaches to economy than the poorer countries of the global south. The Iran-Iraq war that we are discussing in these days is also was a big contributor to a division within the movement. The movement was based on the principles of peaceful resolution of territorial disputes, and this war violated it and showed that even the member states of the movement do not respect its principles. But more than anything else, as the German historian Jürgen Dinkel wrote, the primary division within the non-aligned movement in the 80s was the division between the pro-Western and the pro-Eastern countries, primarily represented by Cuba. And this was a dynamic that influenced Yugoslav foreign policy. And regarding the Yugoslav foreign policy in the 1980s, it is important to go back to the final years of the 70s and final years of Tito's life. In 1979, even though he was in very poor health, Josip Broz Tito decided to go to the Havana summit of the movement. The reason why he wanted to go there is because the Cuban leader Fidel Castro was trying to impose and promote the pro-Soviet principles within the movement. And Yugoslavia, with some other countries, founding members of the movement, wanted to do its best to prevent such a distortion of the movement's principles and its unification with the Soviet bloc. And therefore, Tito personally went to Havana to, in alliance with India, try to combat against this Cuban-Soviet influence. In Belgrade's eyes, this was a successful conference, a successful summit. But as the 80s showed us, in fact, this division between the pro-Western and pro-Eastern countries was not resolved, and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1980 exacerbated this issue. And in fact, the movement became an arena for proxy debates between the two blocs. And 1980 is also an important period for Yugoslavia, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, because in the higher echelons of the Yugoslav party, the climate was like in 1968, sorry. There was a shared fear, common fear, that Yugoslavia could be next, and that the Soviet Union could violate its territorial integrity and sovereignty. So that conflict, in fact, preceded just a couple of months Tito's death, and in the time of Tito's death, Yugoslavia entered a phase of its foreign policy that was mostly pro-Western and closer to the United States, and remarkably anti-Soviet due to these two causes: the struggle within the movement and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And in that point, we can see that Tito in fact left the Yugoslav foreign policy in a confrontation with Moscow, and the United States were very interested to let Yugoslavia continue on this path. So they viewed Yugoslavia as an important shield against the Soviet influence within the non-aligned movement, and they invested their economic and diplomatic resources to help Yugoslavia continue on this path. And the Yugoslav political elites weren't divided themselves. Some of them that we can describe as more conservative and dogmatic saw this American influence as a threat. They thought that the West was the biggest danger for the future of communist Yugoslavia, that Moscow was rapidly declining in its impact and could not do anything in Yugoslavia. But others we can define them as pragmatic diplomats. They saw their approachment to the West as the best and right path for the Yugoslav future. But this was not the only division between the Yugoslav policymakers. The national division started showing up, and with the national divisions, there were also more narrow national views on foreign policy. For instance, in Slovenia, there was a slogan that was popular in these days: more Europe, less non-alignment. So with the new divisions within Yugoslavia, even non-alignment was questioned as a value. But with Tito's death, those divided elites could not produce any new avenues or ideas for Yugoslav foreign policy. There was also a slogan in those years, which can be roughly translated as "even after Tito, Tito." So Yugoslavia continued on the same path and dedicated the entirety of the 80s to fighting against Cuba in the non-aligned movement. So now I will pass to these two introductory remarks to the Yugoslav position towards the war. On one hand, the non-aligned movement and the ideology of non-alignment impacted strongly the Yugoslav position. In an anti-colonial zeal, Yugoslavia saw this conflict not as a conflict created by Iraq and Iran, but by the superpowers. They thought that this was fault of colonialism, that the colonial borders caused this conflict, and some even of the Yugoslav policymakers, ones that were closer to the USSR, thought that in fact this was an American war, that it was created by the United States to combat the Iranian Revolution. And Yugoslav position towards this war was multifaceted, and I cannot go into detail now. I will just focus on certain issues, but I will make another remark. Professor Riccardi told us yesterday about the Italian policy, and even though Yugoslavia did not have a policy towards the Middle East that was to talk to everyone, it was a strong sustainer of Arab rights and Arab cause. Like the Italian diplomats, the Yugoslav diplomats thought that the Palestinian issue was principal, that the Iran-Iraq war is something that is secondary to the Palestinian issues. And they, like the Italian diplomats, concluded that one of the biggest consequences of this war was the division of the Arab countries. So Yugoslav diplomats even expressed their view that the Palestine Liberation Organization and Yasser Arafat were the biggest, in fact, losers in this war, because this war shifted the attention from Palestine, and it also divided the Arab countries that were not able to help Palestine. But the Iran-Iraq war among the Yugoslav foreign policy makers was mostly discussed in 1982 and 1983. And this was because it touched upon the crucial vector of Yugoslav foreign policy, that is non-alignment. So in that period, the movement was to have its next conference after Cuba. It was to be held in Baghdad. And subsequently, Baghdad was to be the next leader of the non-aligned movement. And keeping Baghdad as the host of the summit proved to be a difficult mission and impossible, because eventually it was changed to Delhi. And it was for various reasons. Obviously, having a conference in a country that was in war and giving this country the mandate to run the movement was completely incoherent with the peaceful principles of the movement. On the other hand, there was also the security issue. That period, Iran was gaining ground from a military point of view, and it was threatening the Iraqi capital. So if a conference was to be held in Baghdad, a high-level delegation of each country could not be seen there, because security threats would be high. And finally, as Syria and Iran were decisive not to go to a conference in Baghdad, a conference in Baghdad would in fact formally sanction a division within the movement. But despite this logic, Yugoslavia initially was prone to support Baghdad's bidding and to keep the summit in Baghdad. And the Yugoslav communists were aware of the difficulties of such a choice, but for two motives, they supported to keep the conference in Baghdad. The first one was the close relationship with Iraq that I will discuss later on. But the second reason is related to the thing, to the dynamic within the movement I mentioned earlier, that is the conflict with Cuba. And because the change of the venue of the summit could give an opportunity to the radical wing of the movement, the pro-Soviet wing of the movement, to have its own candidate, or it would postpone the conference and prolong the Cuban presidency of over the movement. And the Yugoslav communists were adamant to prevent this. So therefore, in that optic, they supported Baghdad and supported Iraq. And on this example, in fact, we can see that the Yugoslav collaboration with Iraq was a part of a broader network of anti-Soviet and anti-Cuban alliances within the non-aligned movement, and that in fact Yugoslavia was eager and ready to collaborate with any member of the movement, even the pro-Western members of the movement, in order to contain Cuba and Soviet influence over the movement. And that Syria, that was closer to Moscow, and Cuba in that time was allied with Iran. Yugoslavia found itself on the other side with Iraq. But if we now move from the non-aligned logic and dynamics, if we look at the things from the Yugoslav national perspective, unilateral perspective, there were certain aspects that pushed Yugoslavia towards Baghdad that I will try to unveil here. Now, one of them is economy. The 1980s were a time of great economic difficulty for Yugoslavia, and the system, self-managing socialism, was rapidly collapsing. Worker protests and strikes were something that happened in an unseen measure in Yugoslav socialism. And in such a dire economic situation, struggled by international debt, Yugoslavia could not afford to neglect its economic interests. And even though Yugoslavia was one of the rare countries, like China I mentioned before, that sold arms to both sides, its economic cooperation with Iraq was largely surpassed one with Iraq. The collaboration with Iran grew, in fact, only after 1988, at the end of the war. But if I was to illustrate the importance of Iraq for Yugoslav economy, I can only say that when Iraq invaded Kuwait, Yugoslavia introduced sanctions against Kuwait. Its losses were estimated to $1.3 billion US. And also at that point, 7,000 Yugoslav workers left Baghdad. So it is clear that Yugoslavia had a strong economic motive to be closer to Iraq. Secondly, there is something that maybe I'm overstating, but it is interesting to me, that is the ideological motives to be closer to Iraq than Iraq. And yesterday, Professor Betanin spoke how Khrushchev and the Soviets could not understand political Islamism in the Arab world in the 1950s. And Yugoslav communists, as they were part of the same ideological family, modernist and Eurocentrics, could not also understand what was political Islam, what was the Islamic revolution in Iran. It was an inconceivable political project to them. And the Yugoslav socialists, the reporters from Yugoslavia that were in the visiting Iraq and Iran during the war, they could, in their texts and books written on the topic, they could not even hide their, I can say, even disgust for the Iranian theocracy. And Branko Savic, who was a Serb journalist and reporter from the war, wrote a sentence that in fact summarizes the Yugoslav perception of political Islam in Iran. He wrote at one point, "It seems that the Islamic revolution has turned the calendar of this country 1,000 years backwards." And on the other side, the Yugoslavs we can not only ascribe this to their modernism and Eurocentrism, but also they were not close, and they couldn't understand they were hostile to the political Islam in Iran, even because of one internal issue. So there was as you know, a large number of Muslims lived in Yugoslavia, particularly in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And in the mid-80s, some certain Islamic intellectuals in Yugoslavia were in trial for political crimes, and the Islamic State of Iran responded to these trials. It responded, it criticized the Yugoslav regime and stated that it was denying its Muslim population the political rights it had. And even some of the Muslim intellectuals from Yugoslavia visited Tehran. They were invited to visit it and were influenced by this ideology. So, and also we can see that later on that this was not only a paranoid fear of the Yugoslav government, that just 10 years later, Iran managed to exert some kind of ideological influence in Bosnia and Herzegovina during the wars of Yugoslav succession. And in contrast to this, the secular socialist Iraq was something much closer, much understandable for Yugoslavia. And the main part of Yugoslav decision makers were on the side of Iraq. There were, however, rare voices of dissent, and the sources reveal us that one of them was Jakov Blažević, who was a distinguished Croatian politician. And in a meeting of the highest organ of the party in the state, the presidency, in 1982, he was rather blunt. He told that Yugoslavia had made a mistake, that it made its decision based on money, on economic interest. And for him, Iraq was the undisputed aggressor, something that Yugoslavia should publicly declare. And he even labeled this war as an American war, as an American idea that was pushed on by Washington to Iraq. However, the others in the presidency denied these claims. They stated that Yugoslavia maintained relations with both countries, that on numerous occasions Yugoslavs expressed their discontent to the Iraqis personally. But in some measure, they were right, because the fact even that a Yugoslav general was approved by both countries in 1988 to lead the monitoring forces, and the developing economic cooperation with Iran after 1988 proves that Yugoslavia was not completely pro-Iraqi. But if we have to summarize this multifaceted and nuanced policy of Yugoslavia, we can safely say that it was closer to Baghdad. It was decisively pro-Iraq, and the reasons were, as mentioned, various: economic, ideological, but mostly they were connected to the alliance between Yugoslavia and Iraq within the non-aligned movement that was aimed at containing the pro-Soviet and radical group of the movement. Thank you.
Okay, so now we move on to Giuseppe Spagnolo, I hope I pronounced that correctly, who is a scholar of history of international relations here at the University of Bari. And Giuseppe will talk about India, Pakistan, and the Iran.
Thank you very much. And good afternoon. When Saddam Hussein decided to invade Iran in September 1918, India and Pakistan were facing the consequences of three major events that had already unsettled the Southwest Asia. First, the victory of the Iranian Revolution in early 1979. Two, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan on December 1979. And three, the proclamation and implementation of the Carter Doctrine. The huge naval presence in the Persian Gulf and the Red Army's occupation of Afghanistan lessened India's role as a major regional power, a role which India gained after its victory in the 1971 Indo-Pakistani War and its atomic test in 1974. More importantly for India, Pakistan became a frontline state and once again a key member of the US military strategy in containing further Soviet role in the region. In India's and Pakistan's view, the Iran-Iraq war was closely linked to Afghanistan's. The outbreak of the Iran-Iraq war worsened India's sense of isolation and powerlessness. A decade of Indian diplomatic efforts to regain influence in the Middle East and replace the void left by Nasser and its foreign policy seemed compromised. At the same time, the Afghan issue was strengthening Pakistan and its close ties with Saudi Arabia and the United States. It is not far-fetched to think that India was very shocked and disappointed by its main Arab friend, i.e. Saddam Hussein's reckless attack to Khomeini's Iran. India had developed good relations with Iran in the 70s and now was trying to become a preferred partner of the new regime, taking advantage of its position of a non-aligned country. Apart from geopolitical considerations, the Iran-Iraq war was an economic cataclysm for India. Before the outbreak of the conflict, Iran and Iraq were the largest supplier of oil to India, which received about 70% of its oil imports from them. Like many other developing countries, India had greatly increased its exports of goods, service, technical know-how, and blue-collar workers to earn the hard currency it needed to pay for imported oil. Iran and Iraq were among the two largest export markets for India and the largest source of hard currency to repay oil. The war seriously compromised India's role in Iraq and Iran, both as an exporter and as an importer. The war would have inevitably raised the price of oil and decreased exports to those countries, while simultaneously reducing India's hard currency. Many contracts for industrial projects are already underway, some of which had already been destroyed by the war, had to be renegotiated. The departure of many Indian workers from the war-torn countries spelled financial trouble for the state's treasury, as well as the many thousand workers left relatives in India. Therefore, the Iran-Iraq war forced India to shift its oil purchases from Iran and Iraq to Saudi Arabia and the Persian Gulf states. But it could not strengthen its political ties in these countries because they were then very much bound to Pakistan. After the start of the war, India was obliged to play a delicate balancing role between the two warring countries by declaring itself neutral. But Indo-Iraqi relations soured considerably during the war. Although New Delhi formally showed closeness, Iraq did not feel adequately supported by it. For instance, Iraq did not like the shifting of the venues of the 7th non-aligned summit from Baghdad to New Delhi in 1983. This shift of capital was a specific Iranian request, which Indira Gandhi accepted. Behind this request, significant understandings were developing between India and Iran. Some British records disclose that India in 1982 was making deals to expand economic and trade ties with Iran, which was seeking new partners to replace the withdrawal of all Western assistance and aid. A joint letter of intent between India and Iran was signed in August 1982 and highlighted as a new chapter on economic and political ties between the two countries. Understandings were reached on a wide range of issues. India promised technical assistance in restarting the nuclear power plant, another Sharia project that Khomeini at first deemed satanic and anti-Islamic. It is not clear whether and to what extent these understandings were followed up, especially on the nuclear issue. Certainly, India provided Iran with textiles and common consumer goods in exchange for oil purchased at a bargain price. However, it seems that Iraq was not delighted with the Indian attitude. Iraq reportedly sent a low-level representation to Ms. Gandhi's funeral to register its unhappiness. It seems that Indian authorities initially refused to ship Iran any weapons. Beginning in 1985, Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, who was far less scrupulous than his mother, gave in to Iranian commercial pressure and agreed to send Tehran defensive military equipment. By and large, it can be argued that India tried in every way to maintain good relations with Iran during the war, but the need not to break with Iraq prevented it to push the collaboration with Tehran too far. Above all, New Delhi hoped that the war could could end as soon as possible to resume the very good relations that had been achieved in the previous decade with both the warring parties. Pakistan now. Pakistan also declared its neutrality between Iran, Iraq, and Iraq. On the other hand, it was able to play its card in conflict in a more skillful and unscrupulous manner, taking into account its Afghan mission and the axis that it had established with Saudi Arabia and the United States. The Iran-Iraq war gave Pakistan the opportunity to morph into the backbone of the anti-Soviet struggle in Afghanistan, since Iran's focus and resources were, for 8 years, allocated towards its war effort against Saddam Hussein. Even while some tensions were rife in relations, Pakistan could not afford to make Khomeini's Iran into a public enemy. Despite the large number of Pakistani troops stationed in Saudi Arabia, Zia-ul-Haq refused the Arab call to back Iran in its war against Iran. A number of reasons lay behind this stance. The most obvious one was that ul-Haq did not want to open up a new hostile front on Pakistan's western flank. He was already profiting with India to its east and Afghanistan to its north. Additionally, siding with Saddam in the war would have real potential to exacerbate sectarian tension inside Pakistan. Instead of becoming entangled in the minutiae of the conflict, ul-Haq looked for ways to profit from it, both diplomatically and materially. It was an international isolated Iran that offered the best opportunities. As some British records disclose, the self-assigned Pakistan task in those years was substantially to keep Iran on the path of moderation, especially once the most radical phase of the Iranian revolution had ended. The Pakistani goal was to prevent Iran from making inconsiderate acts and being drawn to the Soviet Union. Thus, Pakistan took charge of making Iran re-enter the world, as it had been said, and to keep it in the orbit of the heterogeneous anti-Soviet alliance. No doubt, in my opinion, that Islamabad succeeded to a large extent. Zia-ul-Haq's support for Tehran during the Iran-Iraq war had several elements. First, and probably most important, Pakistan became a conduit and trading partner for Iran as never before. Iran began quietly making use of the port of Karachi as a backdoor for imports. In this way, Iran became Pakistan's second largest foreign trading partner. Pakistan was also a conduit for East Asian military hardware, destined for the Iranian war effort. According to CIA estimates, China and North Korea, both with excellent ties to Pakistan, were by the middle of the 80s the two largest suppliers of arms to Iran. American arms were also a big part of Pakistani efforts to Iran, in spite of a US-led global drive to stop the flow of third country arms into Iran. Nonetheless, American arms would arrive in Iranian hands in all sorts of ways. Some of the US-made weapons supplied by the CIA to the Afghan Mujahideen through Pakistan ended up in Iranian possession. Moreover, Pakistan agreed to join some grouping to pull Iran out of its isolation. By March 1985, the RCD, Organization for Regional Cooperation and Development, was revived, albeit under a new name, the Economic Cooperation Organization (ECO), with Iran, Turkey, and Pakistan, former alliance. Tehran was chosen as the ECO headquarters. Islamabad also reached agreements with Iran on nuclear issues. But Ziaulak, who was also anxious not to irritate the Americans on this matter, ordered to his scientists to play around with the Iranians, but not to get anything substantial at any cost with Iran. More importantly, Pakistan firmly contributed to keeping Iran in an anti-Soviet posture throughout the Afghanistan's war. Even though rivalries began to mount between Tehran and Islamabad for the control over the Afghan insurgent groups. To sum up, Pakistan had been able to turn the Iran-Iraq war to its advantage in order to focus on Afghanistan and to start testing the doctrinal strategic path, the hegemonic political control over Afghanistan. Islamabad took full advantage of the role and the means that other Western and pro-Western powers had entrusted it with. Despite its war with Iraq and the stormy relation with the United States, Iran lent its support to bleed the Soviet Union dry and hasten its demise. And that was also thanks to Islamabad. India had been benefited neither from the war in Afghanistan nor from the Iran-Iraq war. Basically, it had to suffer the dynamism of Pakistan and had begun to rethink its international position and its relation with Moscow. But it had probably also begun to look at Iran as a future anti-Pakistani partner in view of the struggle for influences in Afghanistan that was about to begin with the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Kabul. A recovery in Iraq with which to resume past good relations was another hope of India, but unfortunately, subsequent historical events in Iraq could never really fulfill that hope. It's okay.
Right.
I would like to thank you once again. Thanks for your invitation. Thanks for these 2 beautiful days here, because I have to go. I have to come back to London. So thank you very much. I hope to see you soon in other occasions. And thanks also to my friends following us by internet. Who they are. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your contribution.
Grazie.
So, thank you. We now move on to Federico Imperato, who is a researcher of history and international relations here at the University of Bari, and he will talk about Turkey and the Iran-Iraq war. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to all friends and colleagues who have accepted this invitation for this conference in Bari after more than 2 years of virtual relations. First of all, I have to say that this report is not the result of a long time study and research about Turkey's role in the Iran-Iraq war, but it's only a first attempt to analyze the political and economic issues about Turkey's role and Turkey's involvement in the Gulf War. This war began on the 22nd of September of 1980 when Iraqi troops invaded the Iranian territories. The Iraqi invasion of Iran on the 22nd of September of 1980 found the new Turkish military regime barely 10 days old. On the 3rd of September there was a coup d'etat, and Soleimani Demiral's government was overthrown by generals and officials of the Turkish army. Notwithstanding its declared neutrality and pronounced readiness to mediate between the two belligerents, Turkey was to benefit both politically and economically from the persistence of the war at a time when it was facing one of the most critical challenges of its modern history. In this report, I try to address two ways in which the Gulf War impacted Turkey. On the one hand, Turkey, by increasing its export to both Iran and Iraq, improved the outlook of its crisis-ridden economy. On the other hand, Turkey's strategic importance in the region was clearly enhanced by the war in general, and specifically by the once possible Iranian victory. As a result, its military origins notwithstanding, the Turkish regime derived considerable support from abroad. These repercussions more than adequately compensated for some of the adverse effects of the war, primarily the resumption of the Turkish insurrection in the border regions in the southeastern of Turkey. Therefore, Turkey has emerged from this prolonged conflict as a major beneficiary. On the economic point of view, in the beginning of 1980, Turkey had many economic problems. By the introduction of new economic policies on the 24th of January of 1980, Turkey left the import substitution policy and used to get into export markets and an industry which could compete with the international markets. But Turkish industry had limited experience in exporting. The start of the Iran-Iraq war could not have come at a more opportune moment for Turkish economy. Both Iran and Iraq increasingly turned to Turkey to satisfy their import needs. Turkey's proximity made its goods easier and faster to buy and transport. The Iranian and Iraqi markets provided Turkish exporters with an unusual opportunity. These markets were not only less sophisticated than their European counterparts, but because of its own severe recession, Turkish industry had excess of capacity and inventory to get rid of, often at very low prices. Iran and Iraq found Turkish products to be less expensive substitutes for European or Japanese imports. Consequently, trade between Turkey and these two countries flourished. Throughout the 1980s, the war with Iran gave Iraq an incentive to cooperate fully with Turkey, including the establishment of commercial exchanges between the two countries. Turkey quickly became one of Baghdad's main customers. 60% of the oil consumed in Turkey was imported from Iraq. By the Iranian side, in 1984-1985, Turkish-Iranian trade amounted to $230 million, making Turkey Iran's third most important commercial partner after West Germany and Japan. Iran balanced its trade with Turkey by selling 100,000 barrels per day of its oil to its neighbor. Specifically, the Iranians bought wheat, semolina phosphates, various iron and steel products, synthetic fibers, cement, iron and aluminum products. The Iraqis purchased foodstuffs, plastics, chemical products, cars, automobile tires, clothing, and iron and steel products. Turkish imports from these countries are almost exclusively oil-driven. But we must mention even the negative effects of the war to the Turkish economy. The main reason of the favoring Turkish goods by Iran and Iraq was the generous credit terms Turkey offered to the both countries. But by the time, Iraqis found themselves increasingly unable to pay for their purchases. By 1988, the Iraqi debt in Turkey had reached to $3 billion. Iraq's inability to pay has become a potential political problem for the Turkish government. Iraq even started to seek new countries which provide better export credits than Turkey. Iran also had payment problems. The war could no longer provide as much benefit to Turkey as it used to. The effects of this economic decline are one of major factors of the ongoing instability in the Turkish economy. Because of the payment problems of Iraq and Iran, the foreign debts of Turkey increased to 65 billion in 1988 from $20 billion in 1980. Unlike its economic goals, Turkey's political objectives are not as easily discerned. The emergence of an Islamic revolutionary regime on Turkey's borders at a time when Turkey was wrestling with a domestic upheaval of its own was not a welcomed development. The Shiite fundamentalism of the Khomeini regime was an obvious danger to the Turkish state, where nearly 10 million inhabitants were of Shiite or Alevi in Turkish origin. The Iranian refugee population in Turkey, which had swelled to 1.5 million, presents two distinct yet related sets of security challenges. On the one hand, it is clear that with the influx of refugees, the Iranians have managed to infiltrate agents of their security service, Salama, for purposes of destabilization. At another level, the Iranians have gotten involved in the domestic debate on the role of religion. Iran attacked the tradition and the symbols of the Turkish state during the war. These symbols are mostly related to Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the founder of the secular Turkish Republic. In addition, the Khomeini regime provided support to Cemalettin Kaplan, a fundamentalist anti-regime preacher in Germany, who had sizable followers among the Turkish workers in Europe. From the Turkish perspective, the renewal of the Kurdish insurgency in southeastern Turkey is the single most detrimental byproduct of the Gulf War. Kurds in Turkey have always been under the control of central government, and any pro-Kurdish movements were not allowed. The war resulted in Iraq's loss of control of its own border areas, following the transfer of Iraqi troops from Kurdish areas in the north to the Iranian front. Kurds had more space and freedom to operate against Turkey. The name of the Kurdish terrorist organization was PKK, Workers' Party of Kurdistan. PKK was attacking the civilian and military targets and running back to northern Iraq. In countering the Kurdish problem, Iraq received enthusiastic cooperation from Turkey, with which it had, in 1978, concluded a secret accord allowing each side to pursue subversive elements up to 9 miles inside each other's territory. In May of 1983, Turkish troops infiltrated 18 miles into Iraqi Kurdistan to destroy the bases of Kurdish guerrillas. Following this, Iraqi Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz visited Ankara to reinforce mutual security cooperation further. The outcome was the signing of an agreement in October of 1984 permitting cross-border cross-border operation up to 18 miles into each other's territory. In 1984, Iraq agreed to permit Turkey to engage in hot pursuit operations against Kurds. On at least two occasions, on 14 of August of 1986 and 4 of March of 1987, Turkish Air Force carried out raids into suspected Kurdish strongholds in Iraqi territory. The Kurdish insurrection in Turkey does not yet threaten the regime, but by engaging it militarily, scoring limited successes and keeping the issue alive, the Kurds managed to shake the regime's foundation. Moreover, despite the efforts of Turkish diplomacy, the Kurdish question has crept into an international discourse. A variety of institutions, including the European Parliament in 1987 and the State Department in 1986 and 1987, have condemned the Turkish treatment of the Kurdish population. The Kurdish issue has become an internal and external problem for Turkey. This problem still continues as an obstacle to the Turkish political stability. Turkey's major gains in the external sphere were due to enhanced strategic position derived from the Iranian Revolution and then the war. The loss of Iran with its strategic position in the United States installation had raised the obvious concerns within Western defense establishments. American-Turkish relations improved considerably in the aftermath of the Iranian Revolution and especially after the onset of the Reagan administration, which viewed Turkey as a vital strategic ally. As the Europeans, even the Germans, were reducing aid levers, the United States provided more support to the regime. Visits by both Secretary of State Alexander Haig and Secretary of Defense Wayne Berger in 1981 were designed to reduce the military leaders' sense of isolation. After the Iranian advance on Iraqi territories, US sent commissions to Turkey about the preparation of Turkish army to a rapid annexation of the oil-rich northern provinces of Iraq, like Kirkuk, to prevent the oil from falling into the Islamic fundamentalist Iranian regime. But Turkish authorities denied such scenarios. Turkey tried to solidify its link with Middle Eastern countries and enhance its presence in the area. It undertook the concerned diplomatic initiative as evidenced by the numerous trips taken to such countries by Prime Minister Ozal and President Erdogan. Within the space of 4 years, Ozal visited, for example, Iraq 3 times. Following the Iranian Revolution, Turkey felt that it had clearly become the most powerful Muslim nation in the region. To make a conclusion, we can say that the Iran-Iraq war, in political terms, had negative effects on Turkey. The Kurdish nationalism was awakened. The use of military forces against these terrorists and the military operations made by Turkey in Iraq during the war made the international community suspicious about the Kurdish issue. The effect of Islamic fundamentalism in Turkey does not have as much importance as the Kurdish nationalism. The only negative effect is the reflection of Islamic revolution as a model to fundamentalist Islamic terrorist groups in Turkey, which aim to establish an Islamic state like Iran. Even if Turkey's political balance sheet may have been a mixed one, its overall balance sheet for the Gulf conflict shows that the economic and political benefits clearly outweighed the negatives. Were it not for the war, Turkey would probably not have been able to escape the economic morass it had created for itself at the end of the 1970s. The conflict provided it with critical breathing space to restructure its economic relations. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. So now we move on to Rosario Milano's paper, who is here at the Physical Science Department at the University of Bari, and Rosario will talk about the Operation Earnest Will in the Italian movement.
Thank you, Shabnam. Thank you, everybody, to accept our invitation to attend this conference. And above all, I want to say a huge thanks to Antonella Fiorio. I ask you to clap your hands if you want. That was the soul of this conference. And I hope somewhere, in some place, someone will give her the chance to show her enormous skills in her life.
Thank you.
So, talks about the topic. Since 1984, the war between Iran and Iraq spread over the Gulf, the Persian Gulf, because of Saddam's decision to begin eating Iranian oil capability of exportation, and so reducing the financial support to Iranian military counter-attack still ongoing in 1984. In retaliation, Iran as well as started striking Iraq oil exportation. But Iraq used foreign oil tanker to export its oil, above all Kuwait tankers, just because Iraq's oil shore was at the moment a theater, one of the most important theater of war. This is the main reason because the war would have involved other countries in the next years. Iranians started mining waters and treat oil tankers suspected transporting Iraq oil, regardless their nationality. Since then, generally, oil tankers through Gulf water were continuously under attack. In 1987, the United States of America, in order to meet the appeals by the countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council, decided to proceed to the nationalization of some Kuwaiti super oil tankers. Since January 1987, Kuwait had requested the United States to protect the oil tanker they passed through the Gulf. At the time, Secretary Caspar Weinberger had elaborated a doctrine for the overseas intervention by the United States forces. The use of the force was closely tied to the presence of an actual threat against the fundamental national interest of the United States of America. The international situation starting since 1986, and above all, the threat posed by the war to the freedom of navigation in Persian Gulf was a reality from which the United States could not escape. The operation known as Operation Earnest Will began on 21 of July, when the first convoy nationalized by the United States was escorted in Persian Gulf water by the United States Navy. Washington supported the intervention in order to ensure the safety of the Gulf navigation, thus demonstrating their determination to protect the strategic interests of Gulf allies, seeking to regain the confidence of this country of the Gulf monarchy after the Irangate scandal. Indeed, Washington aimed at creating the condition for intervention of a multilateral force led by NATO. Although Gulf was not an area for operation by NATO, the intervention in this area was justified by the necessity to protect, to safeguard the freedom of navigation in the Gulf. So the Americans began to put pressure on their allies to get a multinational force to protect the merchant ships and demine the waters. The situation then seemed to worsen when on 24th of July 1987, the United States breached on one of the Kuwait ships that was nationalized by the United States, struck a mine off the coast of the Farsi region in the Gulf. The tension between Washington and Tehran began to rise again as suddenly as in the days of embassy seizure. That event represents, in fact, the first, even if not direct, clash in the waters of the Gulf between the United States and the Islamic Republic of Iran. On July 31, 1987, with a letter sent by the Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, to the related Minister of Italy, United Kingdom, France, Belgium, Netherlands, Federal Republic of Germany, and Japan, the United States asked its ally to take part in activities in Persian Gulf, a request that was accompanied by pressure accepted by petrodollar of monarchies of the region in Gulf. Asking for the intervention, the United States administration tried making the decision to intervene in the support of Kuwait oil tanks politically acceptable even in the eye of congressmen. The United States President addressed as well a letter to Great Britain, France, Italy, Federal Germany, and Netherlands head of government. On 5 of June 1987, Reagan addressed a long letter to Italian Prime Minister, at the time Amintore Fanfani, in order to obtain Italian participation, as in fact it had already happened during the operation in the Red Sea and for the mission in Lebanon, that had seen the Italian Forze Armate, led by Minister Lelio Lagorio, as protagonist. But Fanfani was not Spadolini, and Lebanon was not Gulf. And above all, the Lebanon crisis gave Italy a clear lesson. In a different way, respect to the Italian involvement in Lebanon and Egypt, the mission, in fact, backed by the Washington administration, was aimed at a not Mediterranean context, and above all, should have operated in the context of an armed, of an international conflict still ongoing. The particular insistence by United States to involve Italian Navy in the escort mission had also technical reason. The Italian Navy had minesweepers that was fully adapted to the morphologic situation of the Gulf, and above all, were able to quickly reach the Middle Eastern scenario. The United States needed Italian minesweeper, which had already been operating in the Red Sea since 1984. Authorities in Rome had reservation both of political and military nature about their involvement in the Gulf. From a political point of view, the Italian government responded in a negative way to Washington's request, arguing that it was a crisis outside the NATO area of interest, and intervention by outside power in such context would not ease the solution of the crisis. Prime Minister Fanfani stated in his own style, "We are Italians, we are not marine." The Italian foreign minister was the main supporter of the non-intervention policies. As the United States was pushing towards a direct intervention by European countries, Andreotti had several meetings with Iranian leaders, reiterating the government official line. The problem of navigation in Gulf could not be disquished from the general theme of the solution of the conflict between Iran and Iraq, and therefore Italy fully rely on the activity by the United Nations institution engaged in mediation. However, there were particular positions within the Rome government. Leadership of the Republican Party and Socialist Party were critical with the head of government and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Giulio Andreotti, who had in fact denied the issue of freedom of navigation constitute a matter of national interest for Italy. The Secretary of Socialist Party affirmed that when it comes to Libya and Iranian, Andreotti is taken by loss of consciousness, and that instead Italy had the duty to support and protect the navigation of the freedom of navigation. The foreign minister replied to Craxi stating that the problem was not that of being weak in front of some state or other ones. Rather, adventure in Lebanon had taught the government to be extremely cautious about intervention in conflict areas. For him, there was no alternative to affirmation of the authority of the United Nations. Italy insisted on the role of the United Nations, above all as Italy had received an almost unanimous consent in the election as non-permanent member of the Secretary of the Security Council. In Andreotti's way, a foreign intervention could have caused an Iranian reaction and have created huge consequences in the scenario of the new Cold War. The government of Rome considered that a not equidistant attitude towards the two countries at war. The government of Rome considered that a not equidistant attitude towards the two countries at war, could worsen the situation, not improve the chance to reach the peace. The goal of Italian diplomacy was to reach a general solution to the conflict, which would also involve the restoration of freedom of navigation through the strategic bottleneck of the Strait of Hormuz. To guarantee the latter, it was necessary to reach peace between Iraq and to lead the two countries to accept the negotiation. It was first necessary to avoid increasing tension in the region. The deployment of the ships would instead have compromised this objective. Italy rejected the United States' idea of taking part in an operation aimed at safeguarding the freedom of navigation, and at the same way, Andreotti rejected Iran's attempt to discuss distinctly the situation in the Gulf with respect to the broader theme of the conflict between the two countries. But Italy have doubts even from not just from a political point of view, even from a strictly military point of view, because the Italian leader would avoid to send his ships in the Gulf, even because the leadership of Italian Navy was not confident with the capability of United States to protect Italian Navy in that region. For Italy, the priority remained the Declaration of Venice, which placed peace between the two countries as a preliminary condition and therefore reaffirmed the centrality of the United Nations mission. But the situation got worsening in August 1987 as the Texaco oil tanker accident occurred when a mine hit a mine outside the Gulf hit this navy. That incident marked the beginning of a new escalation with the sending of an air naval force into the waters of the Persian by France and Great Britain. The crisis in the Persian Gulf was an important test for the new government, the new Italian government led by Giovanni Goria. Goria was at the same time managed United States pressure, but at the same time had to seek an internal balance in the governing coalition between Minister Andreotti and the new defense minister, the exponent of Liberal Party Valerio Zanone. Within the governing coalition of Pentapartito in Italy, the exponent of Italian Republican Party and the Liberal Party supported the need to associate themselves with the initiative of the United States. While Bettino Craxi, having lost the leadership of the government, had become one of the most authoritative detractors of the wait-and-see policy, which was sponsored by Andreotti and the majority of the Democratic Christian Party. The decision of France and the United Kingdom generate tensions in the countries and between the countries of the European community. While Andreotti was trying to activate an intervention device in the Gulf waters, alternative to NATO, like United Nations, as the United Nations covered. On 22 August 1987, the Iraqi Air Force start launching new air attacks against Bandar Khomeini, the port complex and the largest petrochemical facility in the Middle East that was still under construction. The response of Iranian Air Force was not long in coming and was focused on Iraq capital in an attempt to limit the air offensive by Saddam Hussein. The war was being fought in the sky, in the Gulf, and on the ground, but Minister Giulio Andreotti was firmly convinced that could find a solution through the United Nations. But in the days among August and September 1987, the military escalation in the Gulf waters forced the Italian government to accept intervention in the Persian Gulf. On 3 September 1987, an accident involved the merchant ship Jolly Rubino of the Italian shipping company Messina. The Italian ship was hit in the night between 2 and 3 of September by grenades thrown from an unknown boat. Those immediately focused on Iranian patrols of the Pashdaran. The Jolly Rubino accident did not provoke causality among the sailors, Italian sailors of the ship, but had the effect of shifting the balance of power within the coalition of government, of Pentapartito, substantially causing the Italian intervention in the Gulf. Andreotti was forced to accept, but since then improved his efforts to put an end to the war, now threatening even the life of Italian sailors. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now we have time for questions. Oh, it's the aircraft. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah, go on.
Yeah, I have a question related with India and the India connection with both Iraq and Iran. So I've seen documents on an Indian-Iran nuclear deal in 1976. So I've seen the text on the Indian side, but I don't know. I'm not sure. I mean, it was prepared and everything, but I'm not sure how it was signed, what happened in 1979, and how it was recuperated after the revolution. And related with Iraq, before a comment than a question. So studying Iraq, I discovered that in 1979, Indian officers got in touch with Israeli officers. India did not recognize, not have official relationship with Israel, but they talked about counter-proliferation through the use of
Sorry, the war.
airstrike against the
No, credo sono le tracce tricolori.
So they were basically talking about the use of military force against nuclear facilities, and of course Israel was planning, thinking about the Iraq already, and the Indians were thinking about bombing Kakuta in Pakistan, and I read some U.S. intelligence report that they actually feared that after Iraq, India might take the example of that attack to bomb Pakistan. For a while we discussed about that, so I just wanted to share this video. I did some research, but it's a very obscure negotiation.
It's obscure also for me.
Yeah, no, I'm trying to find anything else that might be out there, but it's very, very difficult, of course.
This topic for me is similar to that of Federico. We are just an introduction in a problem that is discovered for us. First, we had to study these topics, and the nuclear is hard for me now, because we have to find documents that now are not very much available. We have to go into times. This is just something of
right? So,
Israel and India.
Yeah, and Iran.
There are lots of contacts between. But I don't know too much things about. I say that there are contacts, but I don't know what consequence that contacts had. There are these contacts for the Bushehr power plant, nuclear plant. India had something about the Iraq bombing of Israel. They take a stance when this happened.
Yeah, they were very
Speaking that it was a condemned to Israel, and that for me was a stance taken, as I said, for a pro-Iraqi stance. But I have to know that on the nuclear issue, contacts between India and Iran. Now I have to study much more.
If you find
Yeah. We can stay in touch to pass our information about, because now there is not much.
The Iranian has also a cooperation with the PRC in the middle of the 80s, during this period of so-called overthrow of the Iranian nuclear program. I think it was in the same frame and looking for other providers of technology, nuclear material, and so on.
I know that I discovered that there were contacts on this issue, but what concretely there were contacts on nuclear issue, I not yet discovered. But we have to stay in touch to exchange this information.
Any more questions?
Actually, I have a question which could apply more to. So we are trying in a way to face this Iran-Iraq war in the wider scheme of events of the region and to the extent globally. So my question was.
The problem is San Nicola. This is Frecce Tricolori, not war. I explain it.
Don't worry.
Not a war.
They are trying. Ma si stanno allenando, lo faranno più tardi. No, stanno qua, mica si conoscono. Siamo italiani.
From your own perspective point of view, the Iran-Iraq war and the way non-aligned influence, Turkey, China interact with these countries. It is something that starts then and lasts up to now. Because, for example, I'm thinking the non-aligned movement during the Iran-Iraq war. The relationship between China and Iran, which kind of seems to begin to be relevant during the time of the Iran-Iraq war, becomes increasingly relevant this day. This complex relationship between Turkey and Iran, which seems evident during the Iran-Iraq war, stays up to this day. So could we consider, in your perspective, from your perspective afterwards, that what happened then kind of sets a pattern that lasts up to this day to a certain extent, but it's true of a longer period?
Okay, thank you. So, yeah, regarding the non-aligned movement, we could say that even without the Iran-Iraq war, the situation would be the same, because the problems that hindered its activity, that brought to its downfall in the 80s and substantially, were economic issues, the inability to create an economic alternative, and the end of the detente. So, yeah, I would say that that coincided. In fact, Iran-Iraq war coincided, in fact, with the end of the detente and with a broader global crisis. And in fact, it was one of the areas, as a Yugoslav journalist wrote, where the non-aligned movement had an opportunity to demonstrate its capability to resolve anything. So yeah, I would say that it was just an example. We can treat it as a case study of problems that were deeper and that would continue to progress even without war.
Do you want to respond to the question, or
about Turkey, I think the Iran-Iraq war was an opportunity for Turkey from an economic point of view, even political, because Turkey strengthened its position in the Mediterranean Middle East area after the loss of Iran as the United States ally. And it's the first step to the importance of Turkey in the Middle East Mediterranean scenario, I think.
any other questions? Okay. So I would just like to take this opportunity as the chair to thank the scientific committee, the organizing committee, and also Professor Luciano Montelli for organizing and bringing us all here. Many of the scientific and organizing committee are at this table for creating this opportunity. I know there have been many discussions, both in the conference and also in other times, and we had some discussions also before the conference started, and it's been great. Thank you very much. So what time will we be meeting? Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great. Thank you.